Hey everybody. So this is going to be the first of two or possibly three video lectures that are meant to make up for what we can't do today, which is meet face to face due to the snowstorm that has blanketed the townships and blanketed Montreal and has made travel really unsafe. And so, at any rate, in the interests of ease of uploading, if I make the file or if I make the video, 45 minutes long, it's going to take forever to upload. So I'm probably going to be stopping in and around 10 minutes and uploading not one video but a series of videos. So at any rate, what you should do as you sit down to listen or watch these series of videos, what you should do is have two resources available to you. One is, of course, the text. I'm going to be referring to the text. I'm going to be pointing moments out in the text that I want us to consider. And two, the PowerPoint that I have uploaded to the course Moodle page. I'm going to be periodically referring to that document, and it will be helpful for you if you have access to that as you listen and watch this lecture, and as you refer sort of back and forth from the video to the text to the PowerPoint. So like I mentioned a couple of times throughout the semester, and I think I brought this up when we talked about Gladys Mitchell, that there are these two sort of outlier texts on our course syllabus, these two sort of what I think of as potentially idiosyncratic choices in a course on crime fiction. It's sort of fully conventional to teach something like Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and it's conventional to teach something like Dorothy Sayers, and it's certainly conventional to encounter in a course in crime fiction the work of Raymond Chandler. But it's not so conventional to encounter two of these texts. One is Gladys Mitchell's Speedy Death, which, as I mentioned, really nobody knows. Like, there's not that much written about it. Gladys Mitchell is not, like a household name in detective fiction anymore, and the novel sort of goes in and out of print. It's not a text that everybody knows, and for that reason, I found and continue to find thinking about it really exciting, because we're kind of breaking new ground as we discuss it as a group. The other text that is sort of off the beaten path, as it were, is this Dorothy Hughes novel, In a Lonely Place. When people talk about In a Lonely Place, what they often have in mind is the film. There's a film adaptation of Dorothy Hughes' novel that comes out in 1950, I think 1950, I'll check this in a bit, that stars Humphrey Bogart, and it's a film that really deviates from the novel in some really important, crucial ways, such that when I'm watching it, and I watched it sort of immediately after, even I think maybe even the same day as I finished reading the novel, it deviates from the novel in such a way that the film is sort of unrecognizable. Like, even to call it In a Lonely Place to me felt sort of disingenuous. Like, it so radically deviates from the plot of the novel that I sort of questioned, like, why would one make a film, call it In a Lonely Place, and yet not feature a serial killer. Like the fact that this novel features a serial killer and indeed locks us into the consciousnness of this serial killer, using this really sophisticated narrative technique that I'm going to talk about today. Why would the film do that? At any rate, I think I've got some ideas about that, and I'm going to be referring to the film next week. So what I would encourage you to do, especially since you're locked indoors because of the whatever it is, 25 centimeters of snow, if you can, and I realize you're all pressed for time at this time of the semester, but if you can, if you have an hour and a half where you have time to do this, I really encourage you to watch In a Lonely Place, and see what you make of it, because it's one of these films that really bright people, really smart people talk about it and really love it. And whenever that happens, whenever really smart people like something that I had a kind of negative reaction to, I always sort of wonder, like, what's deficient about me and my brain, and why didn't I like it? But I didn't, and at any rate, that's not a great selling point. I realize I'm kind of giving you a soft sell on this, but I do think that there's some things going on between the novel and the film that are worth thinking about, especially if we're interested in questions of adaptation, which, as you might know, I am. So at any rate, it's a novel, In a Lonely Place, that really is only starting to be discovered. It comes out in 1947, so in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, and it sort of like doesn't pick up a lot of steam, and in fact was out of print for decades. It's only back in print as of 2017, and it's really starting to garner a lot of attention. I know that colleagues of mine at other institutions, other friends of mine, colleagues of mine who work in the period of mid-century American British literature, are really excited about this novel as they're sort of rediscovering it, or discovering it in many cases for the first time. So just as I think Speedy Death was really exciting to talk about, precisely because not that many people know it, not that many people talk about it, I think that featuring In a Lonely Place and discussing it in the late stage of our course is similarly exciting. It's no understatement to say that we as a group are really among the first group of learners, of students who are encountering this text and submitting it to the kind of literary analysis that we've been doing all semester. So we are, in effect, kind of breaking new ground when we talk about this text, and that might be frustrating, for those of you who, really want to read critical takes on the novel. You're just simply not going to find that many of them. But for those of us who sort of like the idea of getting there first, being the first to encounter a text in a kind of scholarly way, and think about it, that's for me really, really exciting. In lots of for lots of reasons, it's the New York Review of Books, the publishers of the text, that are almost sort of single-handedly responsible for this emergence of interest in Hughes' novel. I should also say some things very briefly about Megan Abbott. Megan Abbott writes the afterword. She writes the essay, the short essay in the back of the book, that is really smart, really worth reading. And at any rate, you might wonder, who this person is, Megan Abbott. Well, Megan Abbott is quite a big deal in the world of crime fiction in a couple of different ways. One, she's a prolific novelist, and two, she's a scholar. She wrote a book called The Street Was Mine, which focuses on hard-boiled American fiction, and is specifically interested in the ways in which the hard-boiled fiction of James Cain and Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett circulate a kind of toxic masculinity, a kind of white toxic masculinity. And so if you're interested in questions of masculinity, I know many of you in the annotated bibliographies read and referred to Megan Abbott's work. If you're interested in those kinds of questions, Megan Abbott's book, The Street Was Mine, is a good place to go. So she writes quite prolifically in the field of fiction. She writes, sort of 21st century updates of the mid-century American hard-boiled genre, and she's also a scholar. She did her PhD at NYU, and she's really becoming a kind of like a real star, like a really big deal. And so that's who Megan Abbott is. That's the person who writes the afterword. Well, let's dig into the novel. Well, first of all, it's worth thinking about talking about the generic classification of the genre, or of the novel. It's not golden age detective fiction. It's not the sort of locked room narrative that we get in Roger Ackroyd. Nor is it exactly hard boiled. Like, it doesn't have this sort of stylistic qualities of a Chandler novel. So it's sort of neither this nor that. So like, where does it fit? Well, the genre that it's often sort of aligned with is the genre of noir fiction. It's sort of a novelistic genre, or a literary genre, that is responding to the emergence of film noir as a kind of dominant film form. If you wanted to think of texts that are sort of related to In a Lonely Place, well, one is Highsmith's novel Strangers on a Train. That was a novel that was originally on this course, and then I just had to make a tough choice and chop it from the syllabus for for reasons of time. But at any rate, Strangers on a Train, or others of Highsmith's novels, namely The Talented Mr. Ripley, which is a 1950 novel, these are texts that I think make sense to think about in relation to In a Lonely Place. It's got the sort of grittiness of hard-boiled fiction. It's clearly, indebted in some ways to the world of hard-boiled fiction. That is to say, the sort of hyper-real, urban, seedy, underground quality of the experience of the post-war American city. So in that sense, it's sort of, it's indebted, or at least sort of like positions itself in relation to hard-boiled. But it doesn't concern the same sort of social class of the world of hard-boiled. Rather than what we see in Chandler, which is this sort of collision between the sort of pseudo-aristocratic class in America, albeit a kind of nouveau riche one, and a sort of gritty underground working class, what we see in A Lonely Place are characters who are sort of staunchly middle class and even kind of suburbanite. So these characters, they sort of live in and around the downtown of Los Angeles, but they live in these sort of like relatively affluent suburbs, Malibu and Santa Monica, etc. And that is characteristic of the novels of Highsmith as well, who is writing about New York, but she's really writing about Long Island, the sort of middle class contingent that lives not in the city proper, but in these sort of middle class domiciles in Long Island, or on Long Island, I should say. So so there's a kind of middle classness to these novels, and a kind of normality to them. And I think this is the thing that is worth thinking about when we think about this novel. What it's doing in lots of ways is showing us that that crime is not something that is sort of anomalous. It's not something that is the province either of the sort of out of work lower classes, nor is it a sort of pathology of the idle rich. But rather it is something that is normal, that is sort of everyday. There's an everydayness to the depiction of crime in the world of Dorothy Hughes and in the world of Patricia Highsmith. So for those of you who are thinking about things to read over the Christmas break, or perhaps over the summer, if you're into this novel, I would certainly add to your reading Highsmith's Strangers on a Train, and I would also add The Talented Mr. Ripley. I sort of go back and forth between which one I like better. Strangers on a Train is perhaps most famous because it's an Alfred Hitchcock film. It's an adaptation of Highsmith's novel, but I think the novel is really fascinating too. I'm going to stop the video right now. We're at the sort of 14-minute mark, so I'm going to hit pause right now and be back to talk about the narrative of In a Lonely Place, specifically having to do with free indirect discourse. So just in a sec.